Hey there, it's Susan Pierce Thompson, and welcome to the weekly vlog. There is a saying that up until, less than a month ago, I had literally never heard in my whole life. And ever since I heard it, I've been thinking about it all the time. It strikes me as such a helpful and profound way to conceptualize certain situations that relate to the bright line eating journey. And so I want to tell you about this saying, and it'll be best if I tell you a story about how I heard it. So last month, at the Thompson house, there was a lot going on. It was the week that the Reboot Resume video masterclass series was slated to be released, and there were certain segments of it that I wanted to re-record. Not a whole bunch, it was mostly done, but I definitely wanted to reshoot a couple things. And suddenly the opportunity to participate in the American College of Lifestyle Medicine and the American Board of Lifestyle Medicine fundraising thing to get the tide turning, to get doctors taught nutrition in medical schools. I don't know if you saw that vlog, Let's Make History Together. But that opportunity fell in my lap like all at once. And, by the way, meanwhile, I slipped and, I thought I broke my ankle, but I didn't. I sprained it badly and I was on crutches. And, there was all this stuff going on in the Thompson house. And the Bright Line Eating videographer, Daniel Maggio, was here to shoot videos. And, I ended up asking him in the midst of some of what felt like a chaotic time, what's it like for you to be here, during this time, right? With all this stuff going on. And he said, well, the situation is the boss. And I said, the situation is the boss? And he said, the situation is the boss. And I said, what does that mean exactly? I feel like maybe I kind of get that, but I'm not sure what you mean. And he said, well, it's a thing that, the members of the band, the Grateful Dead, used to say. They used to say, the situation is the boss. Now, when I was born, my parents were hippies, and they loved the Grateful Dead, and they went to many Dead shows, and I went to a Dead show when I was a kid, and I knew a little bit about the Grateful Dead, and I was picturing what it must have been like to be one of the band members or one of the people who helped with their tour, with the kind of touring schedule that they kept up. And I read Maite Garcia's memoir of her time with Prince, and Prince was another one who would go on major tours and have, troops of, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of people involved. So I got a sort of feeling of the touring life from that book as well. And I guess there was a documentary where it was about the Grateful Dead, and they talked about this saying, the situation is the boss. The members of the Grateful Dead used to say this all the time. When interviewers would ask, who's the boss here? Like, which band member is seen as the boss? And they would say, the situation is the boss. And then maybe they'd be pulled over on the side of the road because the van broke down, right? And they'd go, well, the carburetor's the boss right now. And then, they'd be driving to St. Louis to play a show, and someone would puke in the tour bus, and they go, well, the puke is the boss. And that's how they looked at it. The situation is the boss. And as I started to think about this really deeply, I realized that there was a change in my life when this Bright Line Eating movement came into my life. And the change was that most of the time in my world, the situation is the boss. Meaning, I might pledge to institute certain habits or take care of myself in certain ways or read to my kids every night or whatever it is. And those vows or pledges or intentions might be motivated by my deepest values. And yet I might find myself not following through on them because the situation is the boss. The situation being the Wednesday vlog goes out. When it's time to hire or fire, I pay tremendous attention to my team and the relationships involved and doing that as well as I can. I'm now in a position where opportunities sometimes come into the field, like the lifestyle medicine opportunity just landed all of a sudden. So I often find myself in a situation where the situation is the boss. So I say this because you might resonate with this saying. Not everyone will all the time. If you're retired and your days are spacious, it might be hard for you to look back at a moment where, from your perspective, the situation was the boss. But if you relate to this saying, I want to point out something that's a real danger of the situation being the boss. It can be really tempting to rewrite your story of who you are, the kind of person you are, when the situation is the boss. For example, I've noticed myself over the last 5 or 6 years that Bright Line Eating has existed, drifting into a story about myself as a mother that I'm not a good enough mother. And when I look at it all through the lens of the situation as the boss, I realize that actually it's not that I'm not committed to my kids. It's that the situation is the boss. Now, a similar example might be, imagine a soldier, a male soldier, married for, just a year, going off to war, going somewhere in the Middle East and serving successive tours of duty. And imagine he leaves, his 8-month bride or his 1-year bride and pledges, baby, I'm going to write to you every day. And he goes over there and suddenly, in ways he didn't anticipate, the situation is the boss. And he finds himself in situations where there's no stationery, there's no stamps, there's no post offices, there's no time to write letters, right? Even with the deepest commitment and intention. And so the danger there is that he rewrites his story about himself and the love that he has for his wife. But when you sort of ramify the saying, the situation is the boss, and you realize how true that is at certain times, you realize what psychologists have known for a long time. And I used to teach this in Psych 101 class. Little did I know that years later it would have this whole different meaning to me. It's called attributional style. And there are internal versus external attributions. So attributions are the stories we tell about why somebody did something. And if we're telling the story about ourselves, it's about why we did something or didn't do something. And the pitfall that psychologists have noted is that in reality, people are hugely impacted by environments, situations in what they do or don't do. In other words, the situation is the boss. But people, by and large, attribute their behavior or other people's behavior to internal factors, to factors of values or temperament or like internal motivation or lack of motivation. And they forget that the situation is the boss. So what does this have to do with your bright line eating journey? And if you find yourself at a time of life where the situation is the boss, what can you do about it? Well, the first thing is to note that if you're finding that the situation is the boss a lot, you're going to need more support. For example, thinking that you're going to read a book and be able to yourself create the environment in which you're going to succeed at implementing all these new things, not as supportive an environment as if you are in the Bright Line Eating Bootcamp and your hand is being held and you are supported in layering in all these new habits and behaviors. More support. Number 2 is sacrifices. You're going to need to think about sacrifices. So this can go different ways. I remember on a Bright Lifers coaching call, I was coaching somebody and she was just in a season of life where the situation was the boss. I forget exactly what the details were, but she was overseas and I believe her best friend was really sick or something like that. And she was finding herself out of any kind of familiar kitchen food environment. She had very little control over her food and she was suffering from a lot of depression. And I remember counseling her, why don't you let go of the third and fourth bright lines? Try to maybe stick to no sugar and no flour and just ebb and flow with the rest right now, because the situation is the boss to an extent that I don't know that it serves you to hold yourself to this really high bar right now. And that was my advice in particular because there was a time horizon, right? It was predicted that this season of her life would end at a certain point. Sometimes if we're aware that the situation is the boss, we can make sacrifices like just being aware now is not the time to take an extra college class because we're interested in the subject matter, to pick up a new hobby, to say yes to this project at work that we don't have to say yes to. There might be sacrifices that we might need to make to protect enough space for us to be able to do bright line eating. Sometimes we need to recognize that if we're super high on the susceptibility scale, like I am extremely high on the susceptibility scale, I can't function if I let bright line eating go for a period of time. That's not a viable option for me, which means that I need to sacrifice sometimes deeply in other areas to keep it all afloat, right? It's interesting. We've all accepted certain things and sacrificed deeply in ways we don't even realize. Like we sacrifice hours and hours and hours and hours every day because we need to sleep. It's not even something we think of as a sacrifice, right? Because it's just a given. But if we're high on the susceptibility scale, bright line eating might be up there on that priority stack. In which case, if the situation keeps being the boss and bright line eating keeps being the thing that gets sacrificed, maybe we need to look again at what needs to be sacrificed. And then finally, in terms of the situation being the boss and our bright line eating journey, as I've been reflecting on myself, I've been thinking about how I keep doubling and redoubling my efforts to create more ease and more space and to slow down. And when I realize how much the situation is the boss right now, I've been called lately to look at it a little differently. I was talking over dinner this week with my friend and Bright Line Eating fellow team member, Amber. And we were talking about her life. And she was talking about, she has 4 kids. She was talking about when they were young and the sacrifices that she and her husband made because at certain times they couldn't afford daycare for all of their young kids. So what they did is they staggered the day and they kept their kids home. One would work and then the other would work. And so each of them were either with all of the young kids or at work kind of all day long. And she said she looks back and they were just 7 years that were just a blur of exhaustion and sleep deprivation and muddling through. And she said, yeah, the situation was the boss. Could I have rallied and made that not the case? Not really. The situation was the boss. And so when I look at my time here with little kids and birthing the Bright Line Eating movement, short of dropping the kids off at an orphanage, leaving my husband, going off to sit on some island somewhere, or just closing up shop of this whole Bright Line Eating thing, a healthier perspective for me is just to take the bird's eye view of, okay, so for a certain season of my life, the situation is going to be the boss. And if it just feels like I'm muddling through, I just muddle through. It won't always be this way. There are seasons of life. For everything, there's a season. In which case, the order of the day is extreme self-compassion. And that's what I want to close this vlog with is, since I learned this saying, thank you Daniel Maggio, and thank you Grateful Dead, the situation is the boss, my self-compassion has risen yet again. Because it's not wrong or bad. Sometimes it just is. And before I close, I just want to say next week on the weekly vlog is going to be very special. I'm not going to tell you right now what it is, but I've been thinking about it for months. I've been getting suggestions from people for years. I've been mulling it over. I've been pondering. And next week, I'll be announcing something new and exciting on the weekly vlog. I'll see you next week.